Hi, I'm Miss Roz. Today we are going to be making scones. Right, so equipment that I need out, okay, is going to be my baking sheet, right, and then a cup. I need a bowl to mix in, as well as depending on what you have. If you have a pastry cutter, you could use this. If you don't, you could also use just two butter knives, or in place of that, if you don't have that, you could also just use a fork. I also am going to use a whisk and rubber scraper. I have all of my ingredients measured out, but generally speaking, you'll always need your measuring equipment. And then here are all of my ingredients right here. So 2 cups of flour, 3 tablespoons of some sugar, 1 tablespoon of baking powder. Pay attention to the tablespoon versus teaspoon. Half a teaspoon of some salt. I need 5 tablespoons of some cold butter, and then a half a cup of mix-ins. For me, it's going to be cranberries, and then a cup of some heavy cream. If you don't have heavy cream, you can use anything that kind of has like 3 grams of fat or more, so half and half, light cream, any of those are options. All right. Ooh, excuse me. So we are going to make scones. Now, one of the key things about making scones is that you need to cut in the butter, which means that you're going to take the butter into small pieces, and then you're going to cut it into the flour and dry mixture, right? So what we'll do is first I'm going to put in my 2 cups of flour, okay? And then I'm going to also put in my sugar, my baking powder, and then my salt. Right? I'm going to leave the cranberries and the milk alone first until later, but then I'm going to whisk this all together to make sure that it's all nice and incorporated and the flour is broken up. Right, now, butter. It needs to be nice and cold. Right, so I literally just took this out of the refrigerator, so it should be cold and solid, and I need 5 tablespoons. Right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to cut off. There should be 3 tablespoons left over if you're using a whole stick, because there's 8 tablespoons in a stick of butter. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is you want to cut this into pieces, small pieces. So the way I found the easiest way to do this, okay, if you remember from our knife skills, is I'm going to julienne it essentially. So I'm going to cut it long ways first. Right, and then I'm going to cut it again long ways, so that way we end up with fourths. Like so. All right, and now I'm just going to dice my butter. All right, so I'm going to just bring these together so that I can dice it, and so now I have small cubes of butter. All right. Because what I'm going to do is we're going to do what we call to cut in, which means that I'm going to take a solid fat, which typically is butter, right, and break it up into smaller pieces within the flour, right? And we do this before we add any of the liquid ingredients, okay? So I'm going to take all of this butter and put it and scatter it about in my flour, right? So right? And this butter is what's going to help make your scones, your biscuits, or whatever it is that you're doing. It's going to help make it nice and flaky. Right? So you have a couple of options on how to do this. So this is a pastry cutter. Right? If you have this at home, awesome, go for it and use it. And what will happen is that you're just going to push this into the butter and break that butter up into smaller pieces. Okay? So that's the one way to do it. Right, and then if it gets to be kind of it gets stuck in your pastry cutter, then just use your butter knife, right, and then just break up that butter out of the little out of between those. Okay, so that's one way to use it. Right, this is probably the fastest way, but not everybody has a pastry cutter. What you could also do is just take 2 butter knives, right, and what you're really doing is you're just breaking up those chunks of butter that you put in there into even smaller pieces, because you want it to kind of resemble small, like cornmeal when we're finished doing this, right? So you just want that butter to be in small pieces and dispersed evenly in your flour. So you can take your 2 butter knives and just cut those little pieces of butter into even smaller pieces. All right, so this is another way to do it if you don't have a pastry cutter. All right, so toss it about, see if you can find more pieces of butter within your flour. All right, so that's another way to do it. If you don't have butter knives to do this with, you could also just use a fork. And what will happen is that you're just going to mash those pieces of butter, right, into the flour and break it up, right? It's kind of similar in the fact that it has a bunch of tongs to help break up that butter, right? So, but like I said, for time's sake, I am going to use the pastry cutter. Okay. One reason, some recipes you actually might see, or videos, you might see people using their fingers and just breaking it up, which you can do, but one of the key things is making sure that the butter stays cold, right? And so your hands are warm because they're, they're body temperature, right? And so it tends to make the butter melt a little faster, so I tend to not use my hands. But if that's, if you want to use your hands to break it up, you can. I just don't typically do that. Right, so break up that butter into that flour, right, and this is what we call to cut in, right, and like I said, once this gets kind of full, right, just clear it out, right, and so you want that butter to be in nice small pieces, okay, so just keep breaking it up until those butter pieces are nice and small and it looks like kind of like cornmeal, right? All right. So we're cutting in the butter into the flour so that they are nice little small pebbles in your flour, right? This is what's going to help make your scones or your biscuits, because biscuits are made the exact same way. They just aren't as sweet. But this is kind of the same exact way biscuits are made. But we want nice small pieces of butter broken in or cut into our flour. All right. All right, so I think that we're good. Right, it looks like small, right, it looks like small cornmeal, little pebbles in my flour. I don't have big chunks of butter anymore, right? So before I add my milk, I'm actually going to add my cranberries so that they get dispersed evenly as well. All right, so I'm just going to take my rubber scraper and just mix these around, okay? And then I'm going to make a well. And then I'm going to pour my milk in. It's okay if it goes a little outside the walls of the well. That's fine. All right? And then I'm just going to start mixing this around and folding my dough, my flour into the milk. Now, remember, right, we're still talking about how we want that gluten to be nice and light and delicate. So we're only going to mix this as it comes together. Okay. If your dough for some reason seems very wet, which mine does right now, I'm going to add a little flour because it should not be quite this wet. All right. So I'm going to just take a cup, right? And I'm probably not going to use all of it, but I am just going to sprinkle a little extra on top. So maybe about 1/4 of a cup, especially since this one looks particularly wet. Okay, so add about 1/4 of a cup at a time until it gets a little, it shouldn't be quite so wet. Okay. All right, that looks a little better. All right, and so what actually is going to happen is I'm going to roll this out onto my counter. So let's find some space. Make sure your counter is clean. All right, I cleaned everything before we started. Okay, so I'm going to, and we're going to do what we call to knead. All right, we're not going to knead a lot. We're only going to knead a couple of times. All right, but okay, we're going to just dump my dough right out onto the counter. Okay, and like I said, this seems a little wet, so I'm going to add a little more flour because I don't want it to stick to my hands. Right, this should actually be a little kind of on the drier side. Okay, so just have a little bowl worth of flour just in case. I'm actually going to take my watch off so I don't get flour all over it. Right, and then I'm just going to put a little actually flour in my hands. And we're just going to bring this together. Okay, very good. And then you're just going to knead it a couple of times. Okay, you don't need to knead it a lot, right? But just a few times to bring all these ingredients together. Okay. All right. All right, looks good. All right, now we are going to cut these out. Right, I do not own a biscuit cutter or a scone cutter, and so generally speaking, I just typically use a cup. Okay. All right, so that this doesn't stick, I'm going to just add a little more flour because it is a little sticky. All right. All right, and then I'm just going to flatten it a little. All right, maybe about between a half an inch to an inch, depending on how big you want your scones to be. All right, and then I'm going to cut out my scones. All right, so I'm going to use this just use this cup. All right, and I'm going to just cut out. Okay, so notice that when I do this, all right, I'm going to put a little flour around. All right, and I'm just going to cut down and then actually turn it just to help it release. All right. Now, the mix-ins, I put in cranberries. However, you can choose to put in whatever you want. So I know I gave a couple of options. One of them, so a couple of my options were currants or raisins, cranberries. I think I had some blueberries as well. If you wanted to do chocolate chips and you had chocolate chips at home, you could do that too. All right, so I cut out a couple of these, right, and then I'm going to just put these onto my cookie sheet, right. I don't need to because I have a lot of fat in here. I don't need to actually spray and grease this, right, but I do want to spread these apart. Right, and part of that is because I want to make sure that, let's actually move this way, right? It gives it some room to rise, right? And then my recipe tells me 12 to 15 minutes, right? I'm going to just put these in the oven so we can talk again about oven safety. Give me 1 second to wash off all this dough. All right, you should have preheated your oven in the beginning at 425, and it tells me that I need to set this for 12 to 15 minutes. All right, so I'm going to set my timer for 12 minutes. All right, so here we go. Here's my oven. All right, stand it aside, open it all the way up, take my tray, oops, place it in there all the way in, close it, and then set a timer. Alexa, set a timer for 12 minutes.
12 minutes. Starting now.
Right, and so now that's all done. Now you might have some extra scraps, and that's fine. You can actually bring these together again into a ball. All right, so again, I'm just going to put a little flour on my hands so they don't stick. Right, and I don't need to knead it again. I'm just bringing it together so it doesn't come apart. All right, and then I'm going to just flatten it out again. All right, and just cut out a couple more biscuits out of your dough. So you might be able to get another like 3 or 4 biscuits, right? So the dough itself makes somewhere between, I believe, like 8 to 10 biscuits. Now I have this little extra dough. I'm just gonna bring it together, and that's just gonna be my last little one. So it might be a little smaller than the others, but that is my scones, right? One thing about this is thinking about how to clean up your counter because it is full of wet flour and dough. Okay, you can use, if you have any kind of scrapers available, they are very helpful for this. So if you have what we call a bench knife, so if you have something that looks like this is actually very helpful. So what happens is I use the bench knife first before I wet anything, because once you wet flour, it's going to get all kind of gummy and hard to take off. But I use the rubber scraper just to kind of help scrape up all the little bits of flour. But this also helps to scrape up the little bits that are stuck to the counter. Right? If you don't have one of these, you might have kind of a scraper, a little scraper, it might be plastic. This would also help as well. Okay, so something that's kind of flat. It does not necessarily have to be metal, but something that has a nice flat edge like this that can help scrape up all of this flour, right? And then I'm just going to take this, right, and dump it into my trash, right? And then just wipe it down really, really well with some water and spray it down, right? And so that right there is scones. So thank you so much, and I will see you next time.